What about the competition of foreign labor? Do U.S. workers lose their jobs when goods are imported?
These days, everybody seems to be talking about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It is a free trade deal between three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It's one of the most significant trade deals Canada has ever signed. It's also at risk of being ripped up by this guy.
We have NAFTA, which is a total and complete disaster.
Basically, Trump says NAFTA is a rotten deal for the United States. He wants to fix it or nix it.
In 2016, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump pledged to renegotiate NAFTA if elected president. Why were both these major candidates for president against the treaty? Well, this data comes from the Council on Foreign Relations. They're a very large pro-trade, pro-free trade group that influences our politicians. And the Council on Foreign Relations' own estimates say that because of NAFTA, the U.S. auto industry lost 1/3 of its jobs. 350,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in the auto industry since 1994. And where did those jobs go? They relocated to Mexico. The Mexican economy saw a growth from 120,000 auto sector employees to 550,000 auto sector employees. General rule of thumb is for every one manufacturing job lost, 3 other jobs also get lost. So in this one sector alone, it can be argued over 1 million U.S. jobs could have been lost to NAFTA just from the effect on the auto industry.
And I think most Americans understand that our past trade agreements have failed American workers and have led to the loss of millions of decent-paying jobs. On September 19th, 1993, President Bill Clinton said the following, quote, "I believe that NAFTA will create 200,000 American jobs in the first 2 years of its effect. I believe that NAFTA will create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years of its impact," end of quote. President Clinton was pushing the NAFTA agreement very, very hard. Was President Clinton right? Was the Heritage Foundation right? Was Senator McConnell right? No. I think the evidence is pretty clear that they were all wrong. According to the well-respected economists at the Economic Policy Institute, and their facts are usually hold up pretty well, NAFTA has led to the loss of more than 680,000 American jobs. 680,000 American jobs. What President Clinton said was wrong. What the Heritage Foundation said was wrong. We lost substantial numbers of jobs. In 1993, the year before NAFTA was implemented, the United States had a trade surplus with Mexico of more than $1.6 billion. Last year, the trade deficit with Mexico was $53 billion. We had a trade surplus of $1.6 billion. Last year, we had a deficit of $53 billion. Now, how is that a success? I don't quite know.
The candidates will have an opportunity to make a closing statement. So, President Bush, I think you said it earlier, let's get it on.
Let's go.
And I think the first question is over here.
Yes, I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Perot. What will you do as president to open foreign markets to fair competition from American business and to stop unfair competition here at home from foreign countries so that we can bring jobs back to the United States?
That's right at the top of my agenda. We've shipped millions of jobs overseas. If you just want to get down to brass tacks, first thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you. And they'll gridlock right at that point because, for example, we've got international competitors who simply could not unload their cars off the ships if they had to comply. You see, if it was a two-way street, just couldn't do it.
It's very frustrating trying to figure out exactly what China's tax policy is on cars imported into their country from the United States. I've been using DuckDuckGo and Google to try to get the numbers. This is an article from the New York Times, March of 2017, shortly after President Trump took office. And as you scroll down here, March 20th of 2017, a Jeep Wrangler can cost $30,000 more in China than in the United States. The retail price of the Wrangler is $40,500 in the USA. But in China, the same vehicle can set you back $71,000, mostly because of the taxes, Beijing charges on every car or minivan that's brought into the country. Later in the article, it says fewer than 5% of the cars in China are imported. Meanwhile, if a car is made in China and brought into our country, the tax is less than 2%.
We have got to stop sending jobs overseas.
These one-way trade deals that favor a foreign country at the expense of the United States exist with both China and our European allies who are part of NATO. For example, a United States car, as it leaves the United States and goes into Europe, there's a 10% importation tariff. As this Ford Mustang goes from a U.S. factory into Germany, there's an automatic 10% tax upon entry into Europe. We sell, as the United States, 7.1 billion cars in terms of dollars per year to Europe. Meanwhile, the tax coming the other way is much lower. There's a 2.5% tax when a European car like this Audi leaves Europe and comes into the United States. Because the tax from Europe to the United States is so much lower, there's $48 billion of cars sold that were manufactured in Europe using European labor in European factories each year here in the United States. That trade imbalance is almost 7-1. Similar things exist in the motorcycle market. United States, if we import a motorcycle into our country from China, the tax is 0. Meanwhile, if we try to sell a motorcycle from the United States to China, the tax is 30% when it enters China. If we try to sell an American-made motorcycle to India, the tax is 100% of the sticker price of the vehicle. There have been numerous one-sided trade deals signed by the United States as early as the 1960s all the way through 2016 that have allowed our foreign competitors to send manufactured goods into our country and have blocked our manufactured goods from entering their country.
We have got to stop sending jobs overseas. To those of you in the audience who are business people, pretty simple. If you're paying $12, $13, $14 an hour for factory workers, and you can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time, you've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor, have no health care, that's the most expensive single element in making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
This graph from the Business Insider, based on Bureau of Labor Statistics data, shows the giant sucking sound that H. Ross Perot warned us about. When NAFTA went into effect in 1994, we had 17 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. Over the next 3 years, we actually grew a few manufacturing jobs because the United States was in a boom economy. It was the best economy from 1997 to 2000 the U.S. has seen since I graduated high school. Another reason we grew manufacturing jobs was many manufacturers were unsure if NAFTA was going to stick. There was some thought it might be repealed. But when China joined the World Trade Organization, signed by Bill Clinton and not opposed by the Republicans or George W. Bush, in December of 2000, going into effect in early 2001, we went from 17 million manufacturing jobs down to less than 12 million in under 8 years. That is the giant sucking sound H. Ross Perot warned us about.
So if the people send me to Washington, the first thing I'll do is study that 2,000-page agreement and make sure it's a two-way street. One last point here. I decided I was dumb and didn't understand it, so I called a who's who of the folks who've been around it. And I said, why won't everybody go south? They said, we'll be disruptive. I said, for how long? I finally got them up for 12 to 15 years. And I said, well, how does it stop being disruptive? And that is when their jobs come up from $1 an hour to $6 an hour and ours go down to $6 an hour, then it's leveled again. But in the meantime, you've wrecked the country with these kinds of deals. We've got to cut it out.
Recent trade deals,
yes,
and some not so recent. Do you believe as president you would have the authority to unravel some of them?
Yeah, I think, look, for Vermont, for Iowa, and for virtually the entire country, trade agreements like NAFTA, CAFTA, and permanent normal trade relations with China have by and large been a disaster. I voted against all of them, and I'm helping to lead the effort right now against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. At the end of the day, I think what Americans perceive, and you ask me why there is momentum for our campaign, these trade agreements were written by corporate America, were written by Wall Street. The goal was to shut down plants in America, to stop having to pay workers in Iowa, Vermont, this country, decent wages, move to China, pay people low wages, and bring their products back in America.
But supported by Democratic administrations.
You're quite right.
This is why. Because the Democrats are now Republicans. And this isn't hyperbole. This isn't an exaggeration. We've been saying this. We've said that Bill Clinton did things in the 90s that Republicans could only dream of doing. And I'm going to show you this. I'm not going to tease it anymore. Here's Barack Obama. He was being accused of being a socialist because that's what the Republicans always do. Remember, you can't nominate Bernie. They'll call him a socialist. They've been calling Democrats a socialists since FDR. That's what they do. They just call you socialists. Barack Obama is going to answer that criticism here, but the answer to that criticism reveals a bigger flaw. Here it comes.
Believe that. The truth of the matter is that my policies are so mainstream that, you know, if I had said the same policies that I have back in the 1980s, I'd be considered a moderate Republican. I mean, you know.
That's the first black president ever elected in the United States. That's the Democratic standard bearer talking a year or two after the biggest economic downturn in the history of our country since the Great Depression. And how did he fix it? He fixed it with moderate Republican policies. And he's bragging about it. He doesn't know to be... He's not embarrassed. He's not embarrassed. If my policies were in the 80s, I'd be considered a moderate. That's what I was saying, because they're both owned by the corporations. They're both in bed. He just admitted it. He's not even hiding it. Like when he says that in public, that doesn't flip a switch, an alarm switch down at the DNC headquarters. Hey, the president just said his policies are Republican. And nobody screamed. And by the way, this wasn't in great times. It's not like we're in boom times, so it doesn't really matter. Half the country's poor or low income, and he's out here bragging that he's a moderate Republican. Well, why the f*** he vote for you then?
Many of these policies, you're absolutely right. Many of these policies were supported by not only Republicans, by President Clinton and, unfortunately, President Obama. They are bad policies. They are opposed, by and large, by every trade union in this country, and I believe by the majority of the American people.
May have noticed following this election, Donald Trump came to Indiana and talked a lot about what happened with the Carrier Corporation and shipping their jobs out of state. Here's someone who worked for Carrier, and he has a question for you.
How you doing, Mr. President?
How are you?
My name is Eric Cottenham, and I'm representing the Steelworkers Union, Local 1999, and I'm trying to find out what do we have left as far as all of our jobs are leaving Indianapolis, right? And I see here you're doing a lot of things, but in Indianapolis, there's nothing there for us. I mean, what's next? I mean, what can we look forward to in the future as far as jobs, employment, whatever, because all of our jobs is left.
But for those folks who've lost their job right now because a plant went down to Mexico, you know, that isn't going to make you feel better. And so what we have to do is to make sure that folks are trained for the jobs that are coming in now, because some of those jobs of the past are just not going to come back. And when somebody says, like the person you just mentioned, who I'm not going to advertise for, that he's going to bring all these jobs back.
Despite mainstream media's lack of coverage on this issue, it is a very good economy under President Trump. Manufacturing jobs under President Obama actually shrank. When he took office in January of 2009, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us there were 12,561,000 manufacturing jobs. When Obama left office, there was 12,355,000 manufacturing jobs. That's a net loss of over 209,000 manufacturing jobs during his 8 years in office. By comparison, President Trump, he's added 444,000 manufacturing jobs during his first 2 years and 4 months in office. 177,000 manufacturing jobs in 2017, 248,000 manufacturing jobs in 2018, 1,000 manufacturing jobs in 2019, and that data is through April of 2019. Regarding the addition of manufacturing jobs, President Trump is the first president since Ronald Reagan to add manufacturing jobs to the U.S. economy during his first 6 months in office. This data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, published by Moody's, which is a Wall Street analytic company. Total change in employment first 6 months in office, President Trump added 1 million jobs. Bill Clinton added 1.2 million jobs. However, President Trump is the first president since Reagan to add manufacturing jobs, which are high-paying jobs. 70,000 manufacturing jobs added his first 6 months in office. The last time we had data like that was 1981 when President Reagan took office. Interesting to note, Democratic President Jimmy Carter did 6 times better. He added 456,000 manufacturing jobs his first month in office. For some reason, this country, after 1980, started putting less and less value on manufacturing jobs. Why have manufacturing jobs been added? This is the National Association of Manufacturers Outlook Index from the first quarter of 2016 to the third quarter of 2018. And they asked the CEOs, owners, or purchasing directors of major manufacturing companies, what do you think the future looks like? Is it somewhat positive or very positive? Before the election in 2016, only 60% of manufacturing owners thought the outlook for their American manufacturing businesses were positive going into the future. Why? Be even a worse trade agreement than NAFTA or normalization of trade with China, which were both signed under President Clinton. It was the biggest trade deal in the history of the country, what the media never really covered. President Trump and Bernie Sanders both promised to take us out of this agreement called the TPP. And when President Trump got elected, manufacturers were way more confident business conditions would improve. So they kept more factories in the United States and they hired more American workers.
Well, how exactly are you going to do that? What are you going to do? There's no answer to it. He just says, well, I'm going to negotiate a better deal. Well, how exactly are you going to negotiate that? What magic wand do you have? And usually the answer is he doesn't have an answer.
We begin with President-elect Donald Trump. His victory tour, his team preferring it be called a thank you tour. And tonight, hundreds of American factory workers are indeed thanking Mr. Trump. The president-elect in Indiana today walking into the Carrier plant that had been set to close and send those jobs to Mexico. Tonight, Carrier says hundreds of those jobs will be saved, not all of them, but a significant victory for so many families in that community. Tonight, what did Mr. Trump offer that company to keep jobs here, and will he offer it to other companies threatening to take jobs overseas? ABC's Tom Yamas traveling with Mr. Trump.
President-elect Donald Trump touching down in Indiana today to deliver an important message in person, telling hundreds of workers at the Carrier factory he just saved their jobs.
People are crying. I mean, they're all crying. They're so happy. They're going to have a great Christmas. That's most important.
The factory becoming a symbol of corporate greed with this video we told you about on World News Tonight in February. The moment executives informed workers they were eliminating 1,400 jobs.
To move production from our facility in Indianapolis to Monterrey, Mexico.
Trump saw it on the news and promised he wouldn't let that happen.
We're not going to let our jobs be taken away.
He says shortly after winning, he called Carrier CEO.
So I called Greg Hayes. I heard of him, but I never met him. And he picked up the phone, Mr. President-elect, sir, how are you? It's wonderful to win. You know, think if I lost, he wouldn't have returned my call.
Today, Carrier announcing it will keep around 1,100 jobs in Indianapolis, but not all of them, largely in return for $7 million in tax incentives facilitated by the state's governor, Vice President-elect Mike Pence.
At the end of the day, the American worker should not be forced to compete against people in Vietnam who make 56 cents an hour minimum wage.
How do you roll back the clock on those agreements?
Well, you renegotiate agreements. And what you say is, look, we want agreements that work for the American middle class. I want to see, we have lost, just to review, since 2001, we have lost almost 60,000 factories in the United States of America and millions of decent paying jobs. Not all of that is attributable to trade, but a lot of it is. And at the end of the day, if corporations can shut down in America, pay people 25 cents an hour, 50 cents an hour someplace else, that's what they will do. And we have got to stop that. We have to demand they reinvest back in this country and provide decent paying jobs here.
Everyone
NAFTA cost us jobs.
Hates.
I would like to renegotiate it.
NAFTA.
The worst trade deal.
But it wasn't always that way. The North American Free Trade Agreement was supposed to
expand our exports, create new jobs.
And most people were really excited about it. So what actually happened? What did NAFTA do that was good? And what did it do that was bad? To understand that, you have to understand America's relationship with avocados and shoes. One part of NAFTA we don't often think about is this. NAFTA changed how Americans eat. One of the most successful Mexican imports to the U.S. is avocados.
Avocado consumption in the United States has exploded. Going from 1 pound per person to 7 over the course of 20 years.
That's Quartz avocado expert David Yanofsky.
U.S. production has been flat, but Mexican production has been through the roof.
Before NAFTA, Americans didn't eat a lot of avocados. They only had access to them from California and Florida, and only seasonally.
Most of the avocados in the world are grown in Mexico.
And for 80 years, Mexican avocados were banned from the US. Americans didn't even know they liked them. But NAFTA made them available year-round. And it turns out, Americans love avocados.
It has become a much more broadly popular food.
And that has actually created more avocado demand, which has meant good business for US growers too. When it came to avocados, NAFTA was a win-win. It created this whole new staple of the American diet, and it built up this huge part of the Mexican economy. And avocados are just one example of this. Americans now drink a lot of Mexican beer and eat Mexican mangoes and papayas and fresh bell peppers and cucumbers from Canada.
Certain places around the world are better at making certain things, and to create efficiency in the global economy, one nation devotes its resources to the things that it's good at and exchanges those things for the things that another nation is good at or is better at. So the United States is really good at growing corn, and we ship a lot of corn to Mexico. In turn, the United States buys a lot of avocados in the other direction.
And often, that arrangement works out really well. But what if there's something that two countries are equally good at making? And the only difference is that one country has cheaper labor.
Historically, trade deals had been between high-income countries.
Dan Koff is our economics reporter.
The amount of low-skill and high-skill labor in those countries are relatively similar, and so it's not going to have necessarily a dramatic effect on the composition of labor.
But around the time when NAFTA was signed, that balance between the US and Mexico was off. Mexican labor is cheaper. But before NAFTA, that really didn't matter. By the time a Mexican product made it across the border, it'd be slapped with a tax. So Mexican manufacturers were never really a threat. And certain industries in the US were heavily protected by taxes. Like, for example,
shoe manufacturers at that time had something like 15 to 17% tariffs on their product. So, that made it, 17% more expensive to get the product from Mexico. As a result of NAFTA, those tariffs went down all the way to 0 over 10 years. And that meant that it was much less appealing to do manufacturing of that good in the United States. And those jobs basically disappeared.
And that's the story we're familiar with by now. Cheaper Mexican labor means the jobs go to Mexico. But changes like that affected more than just the manufacturing jobs.
It was not only the people who worked in the factories that lost their jobs, but even the people surrounding them. So if you worked in a coffee shop, or if you worked in a department store in a town that relied on that shoe manufacturer, you would also lose your job.
That's how an entire shoe manufacturing town can be devastated by NAFTA. But 100 miles away from that town, you might have no idea. And that is emblematic of how Americans experience NAFTA's pros and cons. The pros were spread around, a little bit of benefit to a lot of people.
Whether you're in Texas or you're in Washington State or Massachusetts, you can now get shoes cheaper as a result of the products that were made in Mexico. You might be able to get avocados year-round.
And most Americans probably didn't even notice those changes. Who really thinks about NAFTA every time they pick up an avocado at the grocery store? But the cons of NAFTA were concentrated. For a relatively small group of people, the pain was deep. And it was deepest in the American South.
The people who will definitely notice are the people who lose their jobs.
And that is the question at the core of NAFTA. On balance, Americans probably saved money because of it. And they got stuff that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And some people lost their jobs. Was it worth it?
Trumbull County. Farmland and factories dominate the landscape, and Union Democrats dominate local politics. But over the last 40 years, well, hell, actually the last 4 years, especially Obama's second term, industry has been hit hard. Many steel mills, manufacturing plants have been closed, and thousands of jobs have been lost. I'm invited to dinner with a family of Trump supporters to talk politics. Hello. How are you? Scott Seitz is a lifelong Democrat who voted for Obama twice. Cameron, his only son who was old enough to vote in the last election, also supported Obama. This year, all 4 Seitz men voted for Trump. What did you like about Obama? And then, what did you like about Trump?
I think Obama represents a lot of love. And I think that he's a good man, and he did all he could. And we supported him for 2 elections.
Yeah.
And then when those changes really didn't come about, and Obamacare actually affected me personally with my own mother, I think we needed a change once again. Mm-hmm. Trump seemed to come through here, and he's speaking change again. So I think we still voted for change.
You want to get in here?
I just, you know, I went vote for either one.
So you voted for a Democrat all the way down, but could not vote for Hillary Clinton?
No.
So how does a billionaire, I mean, you guys are serious, like the working class backbone of America and the industrial heartland. How does a billionaire break through to the blue-collar worker?
We put Democrats in office, and she turned around and forgot completely about us. We are what makes this world go round. We built the tanks and bombs that won these countries' wars, and for you to come through here and completely neglect us, we would have rather vote for anybody instead of her.
With this agreement, we are closing all of these terrible loopholes. They're closed. They're gone. They were a disaster. For example, we are requiring a large portion of every car to be made by high-wage workers, which will greatly reduce foreign outsourcing, which was a tremendous problem.
There have been some big changes, but I think they mostly apply to Mexico. So one of the things we've changed is these new labour input requirements, where a certain proportion of autos have to be made by workers earning sort of high wages, so above $16 an hour.
And now back to our lead story, the new trade pact between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. To help us better understand what's in the deal and its potential effects to the U.S. economy, we're joined by Edward Alden. senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he specializes in the U.S. economic competitiveness and trade. On the fixing part specifically, what do you think this deal fixed that needed fixing?
Yeah, I mean, you knew whatever Trump came back with, he was going to say it was the greatest deal ever negotiated. But to sort of zero in, I think the biggest thing that has needed fixing is the stubbornly low wages in Mexico. When NAFTA was negotiated, when Bill Clinton got it through the Congress, the promise was, look, this is going to raise Mexican living standards, their wages are going to go up, they're going to buy more American goods. By and large, that did not happen.
This chart explains what the man just referred to. Wages in Mexico were hopefully going to go up when NAFTA was signed. NAFTA was signed in 1994, and real average wages went down in Mexico by about 20%. Now they're back to where they were at 1994 levels. Hopefully this new trade deal, which mandates 40% of automobile parts must be made by workers who make at least $16 an hour. That is in a new NAFTA agreement. Every auto worker in the United States and Canada makes more than $16 an hour. So this is an attempt to raise the wages for Mexican workers and hopefully make it more competitive for businesses to put their auto factories in the United States and Canada instead of Mexico. We'll see.
The wages in Mexico are actually lower relative to U.S. wages now than they were 2 decades ago. So what they've tried to do in this deal is sort of force wages up by fiat, saying, more of the content in cars has to be made by high-wage workers. Mexican labor standards have to be tougher in order to allow unions to organize. Some effort to really go after a problem that, interestingly, Democrats and the labor left have been complaining about for years. They have been Trump's real audience in this renegotiation. He's kind of trying to bring organized labor on board, which is sort of ironic for a Republican president.
Those specific changes in the auto industry, though, do those help the U.S. too? Does that mean higher wages or more jobs or different car prices?
That's, he's promising that it will create more jobs and higher wages in the United States. We'll have to see. I mean, the auto industry is complicated, could play out in a lot of different ways. If it does lead to higher wages, it'll probably knock up car prices a little bit, but the effects will be fairly small. So we don't really know, but that's the promise that the president's made, that this is going to bring jobs back to the United States in the auto industry, and it's going to lift wages for auto workers.
And means more auto parts and automobiles will be manufactured inside the United States. We will be manufacturing many more cars. And our companies won't be leaving the United States, firing their workers and building their cars elsewhere. There's no longer that incentive. Before, under the NAFTA deal, they had that incentive. They have the opposite incentive now. We're not going to be losing our companies. That was, to me, the most important thing. I don't want to see our companies leave and fire our workers, and our workers never get jobs to replace those jobs. Those days are over. This deal will also impose new standards requiring at least 75% of every automobile to be made in North America in order to qualify for the privilege of free access to our market. Far more American jobs, and these are high-quality jobs. There are also strong provisions to enforce what's called the rules of origin requirements. This will incentivize billions of dollars in new purchases of U.S.-made automobiles. Once approved, this will be a new dawn for the American auto industry and for the American auto worker. They will see. They understand.
We are just getting a report out from the Independent International Trade Commission on the economic impact of the USMCA if it were to pass into law and be put into effect. The ITC finding that the deal would boost U.S. growth and trade, that it would add about 1/3 of 1% onto GDP over the next 5 years, and that it would also create about 176,000 jobs in the U.S. The report says that the manufacturing sector would be the biggest beneficiary of this deal, although it does note that the new rules that would apply to the automotive sector would potentially increase prices for U.S. consumers and decrease sales and consumption of cars as a result. The ITC also finds that the deal would increase trilateral trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. It finds that roughly exports from the U.S. to Canada would increase about 6%, exports to Mexico would increase about 7%, and then slightly lower numbers for imports from those countries into the U.S., but certainly seems like a very good data to support the administration's push to get this deal across the finish line.
For more on this, let's go to Dan Cassino. He is a political science professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University and joins us today from Bloomfield, New Jersey. Dan, great to see you again. Now, the pair were discussing the new NAFTA deal, or the USMCA. It still needs to be ratified. They have all the leaders' signatures on the deal, but still needs to be passed by both Congress and our House of Commons. How likely is that going to be to happen?
At this point, it seems very, very unlikely. While the president's staff have been pushing this very hard, saying there's a lot here that Democrats are going to like, Democrats just don't see a big improvement over NAFTA. It is not that much different than NAFTA, and so the benefit Democrats would get is much less than the harm they think they would face from giving President Trump a win. They simply don't want to give him the win, and at this point there's no incentive for them to do so. In fact, for a lot of Democrats, being seen to work with Trump in any capacity could really hurt their re-election chances. So they don't want to give President Trump an inch, and President Trump's not giving them any reason to do it.